Does identifying autistic traits in fictional characters or historical figures do more harm than good? Stay tuned. It's April and it's Autism Awareness Month, so we're featuring autistic content all month long. I've made a couple of videos at this point about autistic traits in fictional characters, which is sometimes referred to as Autistic Headcanon. Now that's when you, in your own head, decide that a character is on the spectrum, whether it's actually addressed in the story or not. Now there's always a fair number of comments criticizing whether this is an appropriate thing to do, so today I thought we could discuss some pros and cons of diagnosing famous or fictional characters, and we can decide if I should be lauded as a hero or if I should instead be cancelled. First off, what is headcanon? In media, we often see a variety of interesting characters, and different people are likely to relate to different characters in the story. Now, when you notice a pattern of character behaviors that you recognize, you may then make an inference about that character that isn't explicitly stated. It can help you to understand a character's atypical behavior to, in your head, acknowledge that they may have certain personality traits or even psychological disorders. Eeyore might be understood as having dysthymia or depression. Tigger might be hyperactive ADHD. Piglet might be understood as having an anxiety disorder, nervous and scared of everything. And Pooh himself has been said to exhibit signs of ADHD, probably the inattentive subtype, and OCD. We could diagnose the whole gang. Sometimes people see these features in famous people, especially historical figures who are no longer around, based upon their writings and accounts of their behavior from people around them. Obviously, we can't sit any of these people down with a clinician and go through a full battery of psychological assessments. So, what are the possible harms and benefits of pointing out these traits in fictional characters or historical figures? Let's explore this generally, then I'll discuss the case of autism and autistic traits specifically. Let's start with some potential harms. First of all, when you give someone a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. When it comes to disorders, this is known as med student syndrome or psychology student syndrome when you're talking about mental disorders. We've discussed both of these in our videos on the topic, which I'll link below. Basically, knowing about the disorders makes you more likely to identify them in yourself and the people around you, which can be risky. One of our mantras here on Sci vs. Sci is that we don't diagnose our friends. We diagnose our relatives. No? Okay, maybe we shouldn't diagnose anyone without a proper diagnostic assessment. Similarly, we've covered the Goldwater rule. Again, I'll link our video below, which shows why psychologists aren't allowed to diagnose famous people based solely upon their public personas. A rigorous assessment process is required to diagnose anyone with anything properly. A second risk is promoting stereotypes. Probably no other media in history raised awareness of autism more than the movie Rain Man, which congealed stereotypes about how autistic people live and function for decades. And it turns out the real person on whom that character was based wasn't even autistic. We're just learning how autism traits manifest differently in different people, especially in marginalized groups like women and people of color, and promoting a view of autism as it presents in affluent, white, male children who have high support needs is not the only autistic representation we need. We need better representation of people with all levels of intellectual ability and both with and without visible differences. But what we get isn't a spectrum at all. It's designed to match what public perception of autism spectrum disorder should look like. The Good Doctor is a popular show that falls into this category. Sam from Atypical falls into this trap, and I would argue that Extraordinary Attorney Woo is a similar situation, even though there's a female lead, because the presentation is fairly stereotypical. One of the worst things we can do is use the autistic character as a prop to create struggles and challenges for their caretaker as the main character. Some of the better representations so far of canonically autistic characters are seen in Abed in Community, who's accepted and celebrated in spite of his differences, and is often the narrative lens through which we see the show, since he's the character that stands in for the showrunner and head writer Dan Harmon, who discovered he was on the spectrum when fans diagnosed Abed. Probably my personal favorite show about autism is Josh Thomas's Everything's Gonna Be Okay. It's only 2 seasons and gets a lot right about how autism looks different in different people. And I'll say the season 1 finale was one of the worst episodes for autistic representation I've seen, but the finale of season 2 was one of the best I've seen. Now, that show's probably unknown to the vast majority of people. Entrapta from She-Ra is another good example of a character that is confirmed to be autistic by showrunners that is not a typical representation, but many viewers might not even realize that these characters are, in fact, autistic. In any case, we need more and better representations of autism, especially presentations that differ from what people are used to. So that brings me to why I, personally, justify pointing out autistic traits in characters. You'll notice that my videos on this topic tend to relate to characters that are not male, do not have intellectual disabilities, and have autistic traits that the general public might not recognize. The thing is, we have a large number of undiagnosed adults, particularly women, who may never find a path to understanding why they are struggling to conform to a neurotypical standard. And while I've only really done 2 of these in depth and both exhibited villainous behavior, that just means I've got more of these to do to highlight the different ways autism can show up. Lilo from Lilo and Stitch comes to mind, Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec, perhaps Chidi from The Good Place, and more can all show the ways that admirable characters can leverage their autistic traits to be successful. My goals are to show that there's more to autism than these stereotypes, and that differences are not always deficits. Autistic people need characters to look up to see themselves in and admire, just like everybody else. So why can't we celebrate the autistic traits of characters when they are awesome, whether they are diagnosed or not? Sherlock Holmes is about as autistic as you can write a character, and he's a hero. It's not his fault he was written before autism was a diagnosis. And to the crowd who says, geez, here we go again, not everybody has autism. Well, you're right. That's why I didn't highlight Mario from Super Mario Brothers or Joey from Friends. There are a ton of shows that don't feature autistic-coded characters, and I don't make videos about those. But seeing a video highlighting the autistic traits of a character seems to upset some people. I'll just point out that often people who get diagnosed as adults fail to recognize autistic traits because those traits just seem normal to them, until they find out how different they really are. Often this happens when a child is diagnosed and they start to learn about autism outside of the stereotypes. Then they're faced with reevaluating their whole life and their whole personality. Finally, a word about historical figures. Like we've said before, it's hard to definitively diagnose anyone with anything without a formal diagnostic assessment and differential diagnosis to rule out other possibilities. There's lots of overlap of symptoms in the DSM. However, it's also true that many famous figures throughout history have exhibited strong degrees of autistic traits long before it was a diagnosis, and their peculiarities were noted by the people around them. René Descartes, Charles Darwin, and George Washington Carver come to mind. I don't think there's much harm in relating to these people and their quirks and recognizing that a big part of why we seem to have an autism epidemic now is because we've designed our society such that deviation from neurotypical norms is much harder than it once was. If I was a subsistence farmer, it didn't matter whether I wore 2 pairs of socks and ate the same lunch every day and plowed my field only in the afternoons. What would have been a difference, a quirk, or eccentricity is now considered pathological. These differences may create barriers to thriving in our modern 9-to-5 world. See our video on the social model of disability for a deeper dive into how disability isn't something you have, it's something that society places upon you. So yes, I have thought carefully about the possible harms of highlighting autistic traits in media, and right now we need examples that help educate people and overcome autistic stereotypes. Honestly, I think there's far more harm in not showing all of the ways that we can be autistic. So am I going to keep doing it? Try and stop me. My only next question is, who should I highlight next? Feel free to leave a comment below. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button, subscribe to get more content on autism, neurodiversity, and all things psychology. And until next time, keep thinking. In any case, we need more and better representations of autism, especially... No, not doing this one. Not by a mile. Okay, let's try this again.